Hi, sure. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Luisa Blanco. I am part of the analysis core, and I'm excited about the session today because I think it's a very important topic that we've been thinking about it, especially in the analysis core. We've been discussing these. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Robin Faria. Is the director of the Grant Submission Unit at UCLA Clinical and Translational Science Institute. Mrs. Faria received her MA in Rhetoric and Composition from Loyola Marymount University and has over 15 years experience in research administration. Under her tenure, GSU has helped UCLA and CTSI partner sites receive nearly 640 million in funding, with over 500 grants supported since 2011. The GSU works closely with faculty to provide personalized services that can help researchers through the grant submission process. And the team has expertise in highly competitive large program projects and training grants. So I will let our speaker to provide more on her experience, and please get started with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me. Really happy to talk about this subject. So we were going to talk about the new NIH data management and sharing plan requirements. So let me see if I can share my screen real quick. Oh, hold on, let me flip it. Okay, there you go. I'm using this new UCLA template that they sent around, so I'm hoping it works okay. It was my first time trying the new template. But so today I kind of wanted to go over what the new data management and sharing plan is, how it's different from maybe some other similar documents that you may be familiar with, what the requirements are within this particular document, and then some of the frequently asked questions that we've been fielding since this new plan came out. So the data management and sharing plan is essentially a new document or new plan that's required for most NIH applications starting in January 25th of this year. So this is a little bit of a difference from other documents like the resource sharing plan that are maybe budget dependent. There are some exceptions. So if you're applying for a T32 training grant, you don't necessarily have to do this plan. But in general, most of your applications are going to require this new piece. So for those of you kind of familiar with NIH grant applications before, like what's really different, right? There's essentially two new components. So one is the plan itself. And then along with the plan, there's also this brief summary that is required to be included in your budget justification. And throughout the presentation, I'm going to go over both of these because they both have slightly different requirements, even though they're speaking to the same data management and sharing policy. So why did the NIH do this, right? They updated their policy on data management and sharing because they really wanted to emphasize how important this was. And part of the reason is, you know, making your data, if it's well managed, it's easier to share. That helps accelerate biomedical research discoveries, and it allows for the validation or reproducibility of your work. And this is a topic that does come up a lot in a lot of other pieces of grants, is that they want, you know, what they call rigor and reproducibility in your research. And so this is one of the ways that you can achieve that. And then it also ensures that the data is both findable and identifiable. So by sort of forcing you to think ahead at the application stage, what types of data you have, how you're going to manage it, how it's going to be stored, these kinds of things. You can sort of start pre-planning how that's going to be organized, so that's not all just kind of thrown in together at the end. So in this new plan, there are 6 components, and they call these elements. And so the next couple of slides are going to go through each one of the elements that is required in this plan. So if you guys missed it, let me go back. The plan itself is you have 2 pages to do this. So 6 elements seems like a lot, but you'll see there's the, they're really looking for it to be a maximum of 2 pages. So back to the element. So data element type 1 is just called data type, and there's 3 subsections within it. So the first one is what they call types and amount of specific data expected to be generated in the project. And that just means what type of data are you generating? How much is it? Are we talking about thousands of records? Are we talking about millions of records of data? So it's really like understanding the scope and what that data is going to cover. The second section on scientific data that'll be preserved and shared, and the rationale for doing so is really about you may generate a lot of data. Not all of it may be shareable or worth sharing. And so it's really helping to explain better what data you plan on sharing and your rationale, especially if you have data that you don't plan on sharing. If there's a rationale for not sharing, this is where you'd want to have that discussion as well. And then in the data type section, there's a third one, which is metadata. So this is really, they want you to list all the metadata, all the other relevant data, any kind of associated documentation that you might have that will be made accessible with the data itself. So if you're storing things in a database and you need things to be easily findable, and so you're using metadata like tags to help people find it, what is that? You have to now describe what that is. So after element 1, element 2 is what's called related tools, software, and or code. And this section's a little bit more simple, but it's basically just, are there going to be any tools that are going to be needed for other people to be able to use your data if you're going to make it shareable? So sometimes sometimes you have like special built databases that people need access to, or maybe they need open source software or special codes or algorithms to be able to properly access your data. It's basically just at this point, since you are anticipating what data you are going to develop, what are those tools that are needed for doing so? And then providing the names of the tools or software needed, and then how they can be accessed. Whether are they open source, are they available to everybody? Do you need to have a subscription or an account, or do you need to request it from the PI? All those things can be outlined here in section 2 or element 2. Element 3 is standards. And again, this one's a little bit more simple as well. So it's just list what the common data standards are and any associated metadata that'll be applied to enable what they call interoperability of the data sets and resources. So that can be, what are the names of the data standards that you have? How will those standards be applied? And those questions are really getting at if you work with data that has standards that exist already. So if you're working with genomic data, there's a lot of standards that already exist. So it's speaking to that. Or the opposite, if there's really no consensus in your field about the particular data that you're working with, you just have to share that doesn't exist yet. So after element 3 is element 4, which is called data preservation, access, and associated timelines. So section A focuses on describing a repository where scientific data and metadata will be archived. So this can include if you're keeping it like here on servers at UCLA, if you're storing it in national databases or other kind of data lake storage places, just describing what that repository is, how scientific data will be findable and identifiable, and then when and for how long the scientific data will be made available. So this one is can be tricky because when you're applying for an NIH grant, your grant's for maybe 5 years, right? Maybe even less. And so what do you do with all that data? Do you store it indefinitely? Who's paying for that, right? The NIH has some guidelines online for this, but it's this is your chance to sort of outline what the scope of that data storage is going to be. So after you've talked about how you're going to preserve the data, how it's going to be accessible, and for how long, the next section, element 5, is about how others can access the data, distribution, or reuse considerations. So in this section, you're really talking about what are those factors that affect the subsequent access, distribution, or reuse of the scientific data. So in this section, basically what they're talking about is, are there any limitations on the data that you're going to make available if it's going to be shared? And if not, what are those justifications, right? So are there, if it's, say, human subjects data, is there informed consent processes? Is there privacy and confidentiality protections? And maybe there's other limitations on the data, the extent of the data sharing that you're allowed. So after that, the section B is, will access to your scientific data that you're generating, will it be controlled? So meaning, is it going to be made available to a data repository only after approval? Those kinds of considerations can be put here. And then in C, we talk about protections and privacy rights and confidentiality of human participants. So obviously, if your study does not have human subjects, you can just say not applicable. You don't necessarily have to address section C. But if you are generating scientific data that is derived from human subjects, you do have to describe how the privacy rights, confidentiality of those human subjects and participants is going to be protected. So that can include things like de-identification, certificates of confidentiality, other kinds of protective measures that are sort of standard anytime you work with human subjects. Last element is element 6, and this is oversight of data management and sharing. And again, this one's a shorter one. It's really just describe how compliance with the plan will be monitored and managed, the frequency of that oversight, and by whom at your institution. So what this means is show the NIH that you have proper management and supervision of that data. So, is the PI going to be responsible for monitoring it? Is it going to be monitored by some third party? The frequency of the oversight, is there audits that are being done once a year or more frequently than that? And then, the person at the institution, is it like the PI that's doing it? Is your research coordinator? Is it a centralized data repository manager? Whoever is responsible, you don't necessarily have to name their name, but you do have to include titles or roles to give the NIH an indication of who's responsible for this, the oversight component of the data management and sharing. So again, with those 6 sections, they all fit into that 2-page data management and sharing plan. So what is it? It's only April. The rules came into place kind of in the latter part of January. So we don't have a lot of examples or experience, but we have been fielding a lot of frequently asked questions. So I thought I would go through a couple of those in case any of you have these same questions. So first question is that people ask a lot is, when should the data be shared? So similar to the resource sharing plan guidelines, it's really no later than the time of publication or end of the award period, but they're specifying whichever comes first, because I think what had happened a lot was people were not publishing their results and then not sharing their data. And so the NIH is saying, well, that's not necessarily the case. Even if you're not planning on publishing, you still have a responsibility of sharing the data. Where should the data be shared? So this is a little bit tricky because it is field dependent. Like I mentioned before, if you're working with genomic data, you have established repositories that can be used for the most part. If you're working with less structured data, maybe not. So the NIH sort of defaults and says, if there are established repositories, use those preferably rather than recreating your own. But it is very field dependent. So if your field doesn't have these kinds of repositories, that guidance doesn't necessarily apply. So it's really what's best for your data in your field. What is not included in when they talk about data sharing, or even what the definition of data is, right? So the NIH carves out a couple of things that you are not responsible for sharing. So that includes lab notebooks, like report forms, drafts of papers that you plan to publish, peer reviews or communication like emails or notes with other colleagues. The physical objects themselves, the specimens, would not be considered data either. So all of these, while they are a form of data. They don't fall under that data sharing plan requirements. So you're not going to be asked to like share your lab notebooks, for instance. Another question we get is how long should the data be available? And I kind of alluded to this earlier, but NIH does provide frameworks for this depending on the type of data, but they do encourage you to make it shareable for as long as possible. So that sort of brings up the next question that we get is, can I budget for this? Because you imagine if you're working with huge data sets and, those costs of even just storing the data can add up. And what happens after your 5 years of your grant are up, right? Who's responsible for paying for keeping those databases up and running? So the NIH said, does allow you to budget the fees for what they call long-term data preservation. But the costs have to be incurred or spent during the award period only. So after your 5 years is up, you can't keep using that money to store data indefinitely. So to answer your question about how long data should be available, oftentimes it's dependent on what budget is available. So what resources do UCLA currently have in relation to this data management and sharing plan? There's a couple of things that you guys can access, and I think I have links to them at the end of the presentation, but if not, I can send them later. But we have UCLA investigators and many of our partner sites have access to Dryad, which is they were involved in helping NIH craft this policy. And so a lot of their own policies and procedures for storing data are very much in alignment with the NIH guidelines, and using their services is free for any institution that participates, such as UCLA. The Biomed Library has a couple of online resources, and as well as the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research, their website has a lot of great resources discussing the policy related to this plan. And then my office, the GSU, we have a number of resources, including some templates that we've collected from the NIH about what data management sharing plans look like depending on the type of study that you have. So, having a human subjects clinical trial study is much different than maybe an animal model study. And so those plans are going to look very different. We have a template if you're using Dryad, and we are also starting to do the process of collecting actual examples from grants to hopefully use those as examples for people as well. So with those questions, another thing that comes up is the question of human subjects. So the studies that involve human subjects and or clinical trials, you may have additional concerns or protection considerations for those human subjects. So the NIH does mention that, if you're thinking about this data plan, you should also think about how you're going to incorporate the policy into the informed consent process, communicating with the NIH on this particular plan about any limitations on future use, including preservation and sharing, such as, would patients need to be reconsented at some point to continue to share the data, those kinds of things. And then also, consider how access will be managed, given the fact that this is human subjects data. So if there are extra protections or considerations that need to be put in place, then definitely take those into consideration, write about them in your plan. So with this, a lot of the confusion that we've been seeing on recent grant applications is, how do we tell the difference between what goes in this plan versus what goes in some of the other plans that also exist on a standard NIH grant application? So how is this plan different than the resource sharing plan? A couple of things. So in the old resource sharing plan, there were two components. One was on data sharing, and then one was on sharing model organisms. Those components are now addressed in the data management and sharing plan. Not sharing model organisms, sorry, genomic data, that's the typo there. Because the resource sharing plan still exists. You still have to do it if it applies, but only includes the sharing model organisms component now. So if you have human subject component, Likely you're going to have to also fill out a separate data and safety monitoring plan, which is, again, a third separate plan. And how this is different than the data management and sharing plan is that the data and safety monitoring plan focuses on the human subjects themselves and their data. It's that traditional document that would include adverse events and serious adverse events, includes describing the role of the IRB or the Data and Safety Monitoring Board, if you have one, and then is specific to trial monitoring, meaning this plan only applies to the portion of your study that is related to the human subjects, not to the entire grant application as a whole. So if you think about the data management sharing plan as all the data that you could possibly include, because if you're submitting, say, a standard R01, you might have a clinical trial component, but you might also have some, maybe one of your earlier aims, you're not recruiting human subjects yet, but you're still generating data, right? So the data and safety monitoring plan is specific to the human subjects component of your study. So a lot of the same terminology here, kind of seems like there's some overlap. They're really 3 distinct plans that all have to be addressed in different ways. So that's the plan itself, but there is also the additional budget justification component that I had mentioned earlier. So this is just a brief section that is going into your budget justification, where they want you to provide a brief summary of the data management plan that you've already described in that separate document. So this is just provide an overview, including the type and amount of data, names of any repositories that you're using. And then also, because it's the budget justification, you're also including a description of the required cost that might be associated with this. So all of that should fit into about half a page. That's the suggested length that they give you. Again, as mentioned earlier, whatever funds you allocate for doing the management or storage have to be spent during the award period. And then the NIH is updating their website, but if you're unsure about what are allowable and unallowable costs, there's additional guidance there now. And just maybe I should have put this in bold, but this is really important. Your reviewers are not going to see that plan. They are going to see the budget justification. So just think about that as you're writing these pieces, because the justification is a summary of everything that's going in the plan. The plan itself is reviewed administratively by NIH staff, just to make sure that you are compliant with those requirements. It's not part, at least as has been explained on a number of webinars from the NIH, it's not part of the scored review criteria. So if you're thinking about what reviewers have access to, this summary is really where they're going to see that description of what you're planning to do. So with all that being said, because this is a bit confusing and it's really new, the NIH has a bunch of resources. So I have a very busy slide here. Don't worry, I can send this out to you guys so you don't have to copy anything down. But these are the resources that I've found to be the most helpful in trying to figure out how to craft these plans. So the NIH did a great webinar that they recorded that you can access or just read their slides. They have some draft plans that they've put together that you can download and use as examples. Supplemental information is just further explaining what that policy is in greater detail. The final policy itself, NIH is keeping an FAQs website, so the more questions they get, the more they update it. So that one's helpful to check frequently. There's guidance on how to write the data management and sharing plan. Again, a policy overview. And then this one's not from the NIH, but Columbia University did a really great presentation early on when this policy first came out that I found really helpful as well. So with all that being said, you can also contact us. You can email us at our GSU inbox or visit our website. And if you want to request a template or guidelines or examples that we might have on file when you're crafting your own, this would be the contact information. So those are my slides. So I don't know if anybody has any questions, but I will make sure that you guys do get access to this PowerPoint presentation so that you can click on the links and have our contact information and everything like that. And please feel free to email, contact me if you have any additional questions. But I don't know. Do we have any questions right now?
I assume we have a lot. This is Ron Hayes. I couldn't raise my hand. A lot of this seems like a ton of work for one thing. But I mean, I guess just to get a specific question, we have no idea. Like it seems like it's a lot of cost too, a lot of work, a lot of time. So we don't know like how much you can put in your grants, right? There's probably the same amount of money in the grants, but yet we're going to have to use a lot for all this. But like, is there some point it's going to be unreasonable? You say the reviewers see budget justification, so at some point they might say they're budgeting way too much for this. It shouldn't cost that much, but it's so much unknown territory now. At the other extreme, you wouldn't want to have too little, but you know, that's one thing that worries me a lot. But I guess that's one thing. But the other thing is going back to the top when you said the reason they want to do this. Is this like some consensus? Because a lot of us are wondering, like, in a way, it's a great idea, but is it really? There's so many other issues that can come into play here, because we know from secondary analysis, you can't just put out a data set and expect people to use it correctly. The best data sets, the large data sets, are well funded and they have webinars on them. Now we're going to have millions of data sets out there. Are people going to just misuse them? Are they going to be asking us, you know, a bunch of questions that we're not supported to do? It seems kind of crazy here that you can only budget for the time of the grant when all the questions will come later. I know other people have also said you start, you know, like you said, as soon as you publish something, you're supposed to be getting the data set available. It just seems nutty in a way that it's going to be ready unless, you know, you had I'm guessing like 20% of your budget has to be for this almost. It's just there's just so many things. How well has this been thought out by NIH? I mean, how did this happen? You know, even though it's a good idea, it just seems like there's so much that isn't reasonable.
Yeah, and I think your concerns are the ones that I've seen come up again and again on these webinars that NIH has been hosting. And I know that they are aware of these issues, and there's been a lot of advocacy to shift the standard budget amounts, because you're right, you still get the same, like they're not changing budgets. And so somehow you have to figure out how much you think it's going to cost at your university, fit it into your budget, and cut from somewhere else, you know, and that definitely is a concern. And, you know, I obviously can't speak for the NIH, because honestly, I don't know why they do what they do sometimes, but a lot of the earlier discussions when the policy itself came out, which was a couple years before the plan changes were implemented, there was a lot of concern from the NIH about data not being shareable. And so the plan, I think, was an attempt to solve that challenge. But again, by, yes, adding a significant amount of additional work for applicants, unfortunately.
Oh, by the way, you said something at the end, will we be able to see this file? Because the RICMAR analysis team is actually going to be discussing this tomorrow. So it would be nice to at least, because you went through a lot of things. I tried to take notes, but just seeing the slides, are those publicly available? The PowerPoint?
Oh, you know what? They're not on our website, but I can make sure that you guys have it. So I'll email it after this call is over, so
Okay.
you can have it.
Thank you. I know you did a great job. We're not blaming you, but it's just there's so much. I know other people will have questions, so I'm going to be quiet.
Yeah, it's a lot of information, so I'm happy to send this around, because I know you probably want to go back and study it a little bit.
Thank you. Yes, I think, you know, your presentation will be recorded and then it will be in our site, right, Christina? And then it might be a good resource for people in other centers. And I thank you, Ron, for bringing all these issues. You know, has been something that, you know, we've been discussing in the analysis score as a challenge, especially for community-based participatory research, right? And especially when you have a small budget. It's always, you know, really challenging to think about how it's going to be public and how, you know, you're going to do it in a safe way for participants, right? And then, as Ron said, you know, for people to use it properly too. Yeah, so it just seems a little overwhelming.
Yeah, and if any of you are, really struggling with putting these together, you can always contact my office and we can help review it just to make sure it's compliant with the NIH guidelines. I don't think UCLA has anything yet, but UC San Francisco actually had some resources in terms of how to budget properly for this. Obviously, it's very San Francisco specific, but I think it was a helpful starting point for understanding how big or how small the budget should be, because the NIH is not telling us what sounds appropriate. So do we go big? Do we go small and risk that, there's risks with either way. So the San Francisco guidance was pretty helpful from their librarian. Yeah, I think the other thing is we're only in April. And so it's going to be a few months before we even start seeing critiques come back for the budgets to see what the NIH reviewers how are they reviewing this? Are they saying the budget's acceptable or not acceptable? One of the things we'll be doing is sort of tracking the feedback that we see on that to get a sense of what seems reasonable too, because we just don't know at this point.
So do we know if NIH is going to come back? Like it sounds like the grantsmanship thing is to say you're going to do all kinds of stuff, make it look great, but then you may not be able to actually carry it out. You run out of money. And, this thing about how long you keep the data is kind of crazy because you don't have the money, unless you have the infrastructure at a university. But it seems like you'd want to say you're going to do all this stuff, and then if people don't do it, or they don't do part of it, are they going to be dinged somehow in the future? Like if they try to apply for grants, say you didn't, adhere to your requirements, and is it got to be in the progress report or final report, or what is this? How are they going to monitor and be sure that people really do it?
Well, right, because the timeline to make the data available is at the end of your funding period. You've already got your money at that point. So I'm not entirely, that's a great question because I don't know how they would monitor that once.
Isn't it also, if you publish, right? Isn't
Or
that
if you publish, if you
whichever
happen
comes first? So yeah, I know you said some people don't publish, but a lot of people do. So maybe that kind of helps them, because as soon as you get the first article, that's what's also unclear. You get you have a longitudinal study, so you do a cross-sectional paper. I guess you then have to make the cross-sectional data available. And then if you wait for the longitudinal papers, then you've got more time to make the data available, even if you've been analyzing it. So I don't know, there's just so many strange things about unknowns.
Yeah.
And it's a good idea. I think I can tell you one example was in reviewing a paper, someone had the data available, and we're seeing more and more of that happening. So the good thing was I could look and see like their output, and I could see it, they made an error, right? Or they omitted something. But the amount of time it takes to do that, it's just, how often are people really going to do it? It's sort of going to be in isolated cases where it's great to have it there, but they're making it so onerous. I'm wondering, how it's going to be successful. It'd be nice if they just said, you have to have a SAS file or whatever, and you put it out there, and then it's there, the data's there, but you don't have to do all this explanation and preserving and so on, other than just they have a repository, you just send it to them. It would make life a lot easier.
Yeah, and I know we've definitely pushed back with Dryad in particular to ask them to do that. Just like, because UCLA can access it for free, can you just create the guidance for us? Because you're the one holding the data, you're the ones managing it. Could you just write it for us? We just tell you what the data sets are going to be. And I know they're kind of working on a template, but they definitely had not gotten there yet. But you're right. I think part of a lot of these changes I've seen over the last probably 10 years has been moving towards having a better consensus about these processes. But the idea is once you reach a consensus, you should just be able to check a box that says, yes, I'll comply, as opposed to everybody rewriting the same thing over and over again. Dr. Ryan, did you have a question?
Yeah, I recognize that NIH has got a whole bunch of different fields with different requirements. So we got lab stuff and you got survey stuff. How are we supposed to do this with qualitative data where you're collecting interviews? This is going to be not only a nightmare for storage, we're going to have to be required to tell people that we interview that their data is going to be shared. I'm expecting our response rates and our to just plummet, especially with any populations that are, marginalized in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
What are we supposed to do here? Can we basically say we're not going to share this because of the populations we're dealing with? The cost to de-identify, and it's no way you can ensure that you're going to de-identify people. Stripping out names is not enough. That we're in trouble. So what's the guidance on that?
So I think you can definitely set restrictions, especially if you're working with human subjects, and especially if they are from underprivileged communities that are traditionally not involved in research. I think you have a very strong justification, as you would normally have, to have extra protections and extra restrictions in place. I would probably avoid mentioning the cost associated with that, because I think they would see that and say, well, cost is not a good excuse. But if it's to create more trust with the community, to, not share their data widely, to not, because maybe the reconsenting process would be too lengthy or whatever, I think that there's a number of justifications you could include.
Okay, can we basically say they have to be reconsented?
That is definitely one of the considerations that they included in there.
No one's going to be able to do it.
Right.
That would solve that problem.
So that is in their guidance. So if they put it there, you certainly can.
Yeah, but I
That
just
might
worry about what will the reviewers, the problem is you can put anything there, but then the reviewers say, well, other people have done it. Why don't you,
But the reviewers aren't supposed to be looking at this. Is that correct? The reviewers don't actually read any of the plan, Ron. It's only the budget justification.
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
But
yeah. And when you think about,
well, I mean, if you're not doing it, let's say maybe it's just a piece, but let's say it's the whole project. You say we can't share data, and you don't have your budget justification says, there's nothing. We don't have any money. They're going to know you're not doing it, right? If it's extreme. If it's just a piece like the qualitative piece, that's another thing.
No, you could budget in the maintenance of records and so forth to access these individuals.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and
yeah.
I imagine
Well,
you'd be budgeting in some kind of data research coordinator anyway, right? Because you're storing that data, whether physically in cabinets or, you're doing something anyway. So there is probably likely a budget line item that you already have.
Well, it's not going to be the same though, because you do that now, and when the project's over, it's over. It sits somewhere. And the other thing, like Gary, you just said, even with survey data, you don't know the identity of the people unless you keep that, and you're usually not supposed to do that for very long because the risk. So I don't know, there's so many logistic things like that have to be worked out.
Yeah. Thanks.
No. Were there any other questions from anybody? No. Okay. All right. Thank you guys for having me, and I'll send around I don't know, Christina, should I send it to you or?
Yeah, sure. Me and Anais, that would be great.
Okay, I'll do that.
Both of us, that'd be awesome.
That sounds good.
Well, thank you. That was
Thank
wonderful. You did a
Yeah.
great job.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate
Robin.
it.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you guys for having me.
Thanks, Robin.